had heard a lot of threats inside conference rooms, but none as cold as the moment the new CEO said security would escort me out. The funny part was that the person about to disappear from that building wasn't me. My name is Kelly, and for 12 years I lived inside that company like a ghost. My official title was Senior Lead of Operational Compliance. But in plain English, I was the person who made sure we didn't accidentally drive the business straight into handcuffs. I worked for a massive multinational logistics company, the kind that could move anything from medical isotopes to cheap consumer junk across borders without making customs lose their minds. Under Mr. Henderson, everything was gloriously boring. And in logistics, boring is a blessing. Boring means the trucks arrive on time. The cargo does not vanish. The reports do not smell like fraud. And shareholders sleep through the night without dreaming about federal investigators at sunrise. Mr. Henderson belonged to an older breed. He wore nearly the same gray suit for 3 decades, hated theatrics, and had no patience for motivational speeches that sounded good in magazines but collapsed under real pressure. What he respected was clean paperwork, disciplined systems, and accountability that could survive daylight. He respected rules. And more importantly, he respected me. He understood that my job was not flashy, not inspirational, and certainly not the kind of role anyone bragged about at networking events. But he also understood that people like me are what keep a large company from quietly rotting from the inside out. I knew exactly where I stood. I was never the person at the podium during shareholder meetings. I was the woman behind the scenes reading every line, checking every vendor code, and catching the kind of legal landmine arrogant people step over because they assume the floor will always hold. I never needed applause. I just needed the company to still be standing at the end of the quarter. For years, that was our arrangement. Mr. Henderson built the frame, and I made sure termites never got the chance to turn it into dust. Then Mr. Henderson died, and the empty space he left behind was filled not with stability or experience, but with Madison. The board adored her immediately. The way insulated people in glass towers fall in love with anyone who can turn delusion into a slide deck. Madison was 36, armed with a polished MBA from a school that cost more than my house. And she moved through the office in heels that clicked like a warning bell. She did not talk so much as broadcast. No sentence of hers was complete without words like synergy, agility, disruption, or reframing the narrative. Within days, the company stopped looking like itself. The soft beige walls were repainted an aggressive, sterile white. Quiet work areas were torn open and replaced with bright brainstorming zones where people stood around whiteboards drawing nonsense arrows and congratulating each other for thinking big. The old soundtrack of keyboards, phones, and real work got drowned out by loud laughter, expensive shoes, and meeting after meeting where nobody walked out responsible for anything measurable. I watched all of it from my corner office on the 14th floor. To people like Madison, I was invisible. I was legacy staff, a leftover artifact from the Henderson era, probably the kind of employee she assumed was clinging to a pension, a Rolodex, and a fear of progress. She looked at me the way people look at an old filing cabinet they have not yet figured out how to throw away without looking cruel. What she did not understand was that my silence had never been submission. It was habit. In my world, the person talking the loudest in the room is usually the one working hardest to bury something. Madison walked in, practically announcing that she had plenty to hide. She just thought charisma would keep anyone from noticing the dirt under her fingernails. Madison's first 3 months felt like watching major surgery performed by someone whose only medical training came from inspirational online videos. At first, everything happened quietly enough that outsiders could pretend it was just a normal leadership transition. But I could see the pattern immediately. Every disappearance looked like a red mark on a chart. The vice president of North American Ground Transport was gone on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, his email had been disabled and his name had vanished from the org chart. The head of customs brokerage supposedly retired unexpectedly to spend more time with family. Which would have been more convincing if everyone on the 14th floor did not know he hated family dinners more than acid reflux. Madison replaced people the way careless people replace batteries, without ever asking what the machine actually does. And the problem was not just that the new hires lacked experience. They were wrong in a deeper way. They did not understand supply chains, border clearance, hazardous material handling, or the difference between a harmless delay and a federal violation. They knew how to smile at the right moments, repeat Madison's vocabulary, and nod with great enthusiasm whenever she floated another shiny slogan. The office started living in a very modern kind of panic. Everybody looked busy. Everybody was booked solid. Everybody carried a tablet and talked about innovation. But the real work slowed down. The mistakes multiplied, and actual competence thinned out like cheap paint. The people who had kept the company upright through peak seasons, fuel crews, customs changes, and emergency reroutes were being pushed out one by one. No one said it loudly, but everyone felt it. This was not restructuring. It was a purge with better branding. I did not intervene right away. Panic is what amateurs reach for. I watched. I listened. I waited. Because in my line of work, data beats outrage every single time. What finally put me on alert was not the new wall paint or the ridiculous innovation theater. It was the vendor approval logs. Compliance exists for a reason. Every new partner is supposed to be vetted for sanctions exposure, conflicts of interest, financial stability, licensing, and whether they are legally equipped to handle the kinds of dangerous goods we move. That is not paperwork for paperwork's sake. That is what keeps a company from wiring millions of dollars to a shell operation and then acting surprised when federal agents start asking questions. Then I started seeing names that had never crossed my desk. A consulting firm based in the Cayman Islands, a fleet GPS vendor with no DUNS number, an IT contractor that had existed for less than a week. The invoices were being approved directly through the CEO's office. No compliance review, no risk memo, no legal sign-off, just a neat little executive approval stamp. As if federal law were an outdated suggestion you could ignore if the proposal deck looked modern enough. I printed the records and took them to Tyler, Madison's right-hand man. Tyler was the kind of executive assistant turned enforcer who wore tailored vests year-round, avoided direct eye contact, and somehow still projected smugness from every angle. I asked him about the GPS vendor. No website. No recognized operating history. Nothing that would make a sane person comfortable. Tyler laughed, dry and dismissive, like he was humoring someone too old to appreciate the speed of the new economy. He told me I was thinking too logically, said we were moving fast and did not have time for red tape. I told him it was not red tape. It was the law. If we were transporting hazardous materials, our tracking partners had to be certified. Tyler shrugged and said Madison had already approved it. My job, according to him, was to file it, not question it. That was the first moment I smelled the threat underneath all their polished corporate language. Tyler never raised his voice. Men like him rarely do when they think they are winning. The threat came wrapped in a perfectly office-friendly sentence. Either you file it, Kelly, or we find someone who will. To anyone on the outside, it would have sounded like a routine disagreement over process. But I had been in this industry far too long to miss what he was really saying. Get quiet. Get compliant. Or get gone. I went back to my office, closed the blinds, sat down at my terminal, and felt something cold and hard settle in my stomach. It was not fear. It was the kind of instinct you get when you realize the weather just changed and the thing moving toward you has teeth. If they wanted me to file it, I would file it my way. That was the day I started the shadow log. Every time they bypassed protocol, I documented it. Every time they overrode a flagged warning, I saved a copy with a timestamp. Every vague email, every approval lacking legal basis, every meeting where somebody used the word flexibility as camouflage for something plainly illegal. I archived, I digitized everything, verified everything, and backed it up somewhere the company network could not touch. They thought they were stripping the company for parts, selling off the boring, profitable divisions to fund Madison's glossy tech fantasies. They thought titles gave them gravity. They thought a nicer office and louder vocabulary made them untouchable. What they forgot was simple. The higher you climb on a weak structure, the worse the fall when the floor gives out. That evening, I sat in my office and watched the sunset smear itself across the glass towers outside. I exhaled slowly and made a decision. I was done arguing. Arguments warn people. Silence catches them sleeping. If you've dealt with people like Tyler before, comment number 1 below. At that point, I did not know exactly how I was going to cut them down, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not going to be the one who bled first. Over the next 4 weeks, the atmosphere in the company changed from merely toxic to actively radioactive. Madison was no longer just a vain CEO with a talent for empty slogans. She was becoming dangerous in ways you could actually measure in risk exposure. In lost revenue. In the probability of a refrigerated truck dying in the middle of the desert with life-saving medication inside. Every decision she made felt like it had been designed by somebody who had never stood in a warehouse, never talked to a driver, and never understood how small cost cuts can turn into major disasters. The first signal came from something almost laughably petty: the coffee machines. For 20 years, we had used a local vendor. The coffee was not magical, but it was decent, stable, and fair trade. Then, one Monday, all of it vanished. In its place were sleek, app-enabled dispensers that forced employees to scan a QR code and watch a 15-second internal branding ad featuring Madison before dispensing a lukewarm cup of brown disappointment. Every cup is a touch point with leadership. The internal memo said. I stood there, staring at Madison's face on a tiny screen, talking about paradigm shifts, and realized something immediately. She was broke. I went back to my desk and pulled the quarterly projections, which they had recently hidden behind several new security layers. For most employees, those would have been locked doors. For me, they were just a mild inconvenience. The numbers were bleeding red. The core logistics business, the boring part that actually paid the bills, was down 18%. Why? Because Madison had fired veteran dispatchers and replaced them with an AI routing system that was currently sending refrigerated insulin shipments through Arizona in July. I sat there reading the reports and saw the truth in plain text. This was no longer branding nonsense. This was the kind of incompetence that gets people hurt and then rebranded as strategic turbulence. The real slap came on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of an email with one of those painfully smooth corporate subject lines: structural realignment, streamlining compliance. I did not need to open it to know it would be stuffed with polished language designed to soften blunt force stupidity. Still, I opened it because I wanted to remember exactly how they tried to legalize nonsense. According to the email, in order to better align with the company's agility goals, operational compliance would be folded under public relations. Then came the sentence that actually made me laugh out loud in my empty office. We believe compliance is, at its core, a storytelling function. Storytelling. I leaned back and laughed so hard I nearly choked. Compliance is not storytelling. Compliance is the thing that keeps your story from ending in criminal court. Putting compliance under PR is like putting the fire department under an arsonist because he photographs well. They did not want problems fixed anymore. They wanted problems spun, framed, and smoothed over until the stock market could swallow them without asking questions. Half an hour later, Chloe from HR appeared at my door without knocking. She had the kind of sweet, overtrained voice people use when they are trying to package disrespect as wellness. She chirped about a security audit involving all legacy badges. My heart did not leap. It just got heavier for one beat. My badge. I told her it worked fine. She smiled and said Madison wanted everyone moved to the new biometric system. Face scanning. No more old RFID cards. We needed to hand in the old ones so the technology could be recycled. Recycled. I repeated the word in my head like I was biting down on metal. They were not trying to recycle anything. They were trying to erase it. Erase the old systems. Erase the old access paths. Erase the old accountability. And most of all, erase the one object in that building that could still prove what they had really been doing. So I smiled at Chloe and said I would bring it down later. It was one of the cleanest lies I had ever told. After Chloe left, her syrupy perfume hung in the doorway for a few seconds before the room settled back into its usual scent of paper, Stella coffee, and overheated electronics. I looked down at the badge on my desk. To Chloe. It was just an old piece of plastic with peeling laminate. To Madison. It was an ugly remnant of the past. She wanted scrubbed out of the building. To me, it was the black box of a crashing plane. I had known for 2 years that this badge might someday save the company or destroy the people trying to run it. After a corruption scandal in Chicago, the old board had panicked just enough to do something smart. They quietly approved a secret initiative called Project Glasshouse. The idea was simple and terrifying. If management ever went rogue again, there needed to be an immutable record of what they did, where they did it, who was present, and what systems were involved. They did not hand that responsibility to legal. It's NOC, or HR. They handed it to me. My badge looked identical to every other badge in the building. But its RFID chip carried a secondary encrypted layer. Every time I badged into a sensitive area, the boardroom, server room, executive archive, it did more than unlock a door. It triggered a passive metadata capture. Who entered, how long they stayed, what documents were projected, what files moved across the secured local network, what device signatures were present. It was not cinematic surveillance. It was more dangerous than that. It was digital notarization. I checked the time. Tuesday. The old badges would be deactivated at 5 on Friday. That meant I had 3 days to make them hand me enough rope to build their own gallows. Instead of panicking, I felt my mind sharpen. People cornered by executive power usually beg, negotiate, or polish their resumes. I started planning. Because when someone mistakes your patience for weakness, there is no sweeter correction than letting them keep talking until the evidence finishes the sentence for them. The next 3 days turned into a sequence of movements so precise they almost felt mechanical. I showed up at every meeting I could reasonably insert myself into. I sat at the back, kept my face neutral, spoke only when necessary, and let myself look like exactly what Madison believed. I was one more aging compliance officer trying to stay relevant in a company sprinting toward the future. In reality, the badge hanging quietly at my hip was doing more useful work than any 6-figure consultant she had hired. I entered strategy sessions where Tyler casually floated the idea of shifting liability for lost cargo onto subcontractors in direct violation of contractual obligations. I badged into the records room while physical contracts were being shredded, even though they should have been preserved due to pending investigative risk. I moved through the executive archive, the legal floor, the secured server corridor, and the boardroom. Every badge swipe marked a point in time. Every point in time became another link in a chain of evidence. None of them realized they were forging for me. By Thursday afternoon, I could feel the pressure tightening. My account access started glitching. I got locked out of the server intermittently. My email password expired twice in one day. They were trying to wear me down, frustrate me, maybe push me into quitting before they had to pay severance. The thing they underestimated was the one quality age had only sharpened in me: spite. That evening, I sat alone in my office, watching the sunset smear gold and rust across the city skyline, reflected in the tower Madison thought she ruled. I lit a cigarette near the smoke detector. I knew exactly how to disable because I had written the safety protocol myself. The smoke drifted toward the vent while the pieces in my head kept locking into place. They thought they were modernizing a business. What they were really doing was leaving a paperless trail so clean it was almost insulting. By then, I was no longer just collecting mistakes. I was building a scaffold out of their own metadata and waiting for them to step up onto it. Friday morning, the calendar invite landed in my inbox like a formal execution notice wrapped in business language. Leadership Realignment Review. Host Madison. CEO. Attendees Kelly. Compliance Simon. General Counsel. Location Boardroom A. Time 2:00 p.m. It was so obvious, it almost felt lazy. I stared at it for a few seconds, then closed the window without reacting, even though there was no one in my office to perform comm for. At lunch, I took a sandwich across the street to the little park facing the building. I sat on a bench and looked up at the polished glass tower reflecting clouds like it was a symbol of strength. From the outside, it looked like success. Scale. Power. Precision. What nobody outside could see was the rot spreading through the inside of it. The rerouted shipments. The deleted emails. The shell invoices siphoning money out of the system. The consultants floating above it all like expensive mold. I ate half the sandwich and could not taste any of it. When the last battle gets close, your stomach stops acting like part of the team. I went back upstairs. I stopped in the restroom, washed my hands, and looked at myself under fluorescent lighting, cruel enough to expose every sleepless night I had banked over the last few months. I saw the circles under my eyes, the silver in my hair, the fatigue of 12 years spent making sure this company did not accidentally blow itself apart. But I also saw that my eyes were still sharp, the eyes of someone who checked the parachute while everyone else was ordering champagne in the cockpit. I unclipped the badge from my belt and held it in my palm for a moment, weighing what it really meant. If you're still with me, hit like on this video so I know you're standing in the smoke with me. Then I looked at my reflection and said quietly, "All right, let's go get fired," and I walked down the hallway toward Boardroom A, like someone who already knew who the condemned person really was. The glass walls of Boardroom A were frosted, but I could still see silhouettes moving inside. Madison was pacing. Simon was seated and painfully still, like a witness waiting for a trial he never wanted to be part of. I lifted my badge to the reader. The light flashed green. The lock clicked open. The system registered my entry, Kelly. Ena 957 p.m. Authorized. What nobody else knew was that the hidden protocol inside the badge had just whispered to the mainframe that a monitored session had begun and the chain of custody was now active. The room itself was 10 degrees colder than the rest of the floor. Madison liked it that way. She once claimed low temperatures sharpened synapses. But I had always assumed she simply enjoyed watching other people shiver. I walked in and ignored the chair that had been pulled out for me at the far end of the table. Instead, I placed my manila folder on the polished wood. The sound was soft, just paper against lacquer. But in that room, it landed like a gun being laid on the table. Madison kept swiping at her iPad for a moment longer. Unwilling to break character, Simon stared down at the mahogany surface, like he hoped it might split open and swallow him whole. I stayed standing and let the silence stretch a little longer. People like Madison hate silence because it robs them of control over the tempo. Eventually, she stopped and turned to Simon with the same bored authority someone uses to order coffee. "Go ahead." Simon cleared his throat. It sounded dry and mechanical, like gears catching in an old machine. I looked at him and saw exactly what he was, a company lawyer who had survived for years by staying smaller than the danger around him and hoping nobody ever noticed how much he already knew. The problem was that this time the danger was sitting at the head of the table, wearing designer heels and mistaking swagger for immunity. I was not afraid. I just felt the mechanism click into its final position. Simon began with the kind of language only corporate attorneys can say out loud without choking on it. Significant transformation, agile integrated model, elimination of functional redundancy. I cut him off before he could finish burying my department in jargon. "Speak English." "Simon." He blinked, swallowed, and finally said it plainly. They were eliminating the standalone compliance function. I repeated the phrase slowly, so it could sound as absurd in the air as it did in my head. Eliminating compliance. Removing the brakes from a speeding car. That was when Madison finally looked directly at me. Her eyes were cold and flat. She said they did not need a department of people whose job was to say no all day. They needed enablers. They needed people aligned with momentum. Then she delivered the insult she had clearly practiced. My energy was historic. Heavy. Not aligned with the brand. Historic energy. I tasted the phrase like broken glass. In this company, following regulations had become outdated behavior. Obeying the law had become a branding issue. Then came the dirtier part. Madison announced that my role was terminated effective immediately. 2 weeks of severance in exchange for signing a standard NDA. If I refused, I would get nothing. And they would contest my unemployment claim on the basis of performance problems. 12 years of spotless reviews reduced to landfill because a new CEO needed a cleaner narrative. Simon slid the paperwork toward me. Madison turned back to her iPad as if I had already been deleted from the building. Sign it. Leave your laptop. Security will escort you out. The cruelty of it was the point. She did not just want me fired. She wanted me diminished. She wanted me to feel like a confused middle-aged woman who could not keep up with slack and needed to be gently pushed into retirement. But I did not feel small. I felt like a demolition expert listening to the last few seconds of a countdown only she could hear. Madison thought she was ending my career. What she was actually doing was walking backward into evidence. I never touched the NDA. I looked at Simon first. Then at Madison. I'm not signing that. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the air cleanly. Madison let out a dramatic sigh. The kind people use when they think resistance is just emotional inconvenience. She told Simon to call security. Said if I wanted to leave the hard way, then I could leave the hard way. Then she repeated the line slowly, with all the contempt she could fit into it. Security would escort me out. I reached for my belt loop and unclipped my badge. The small plastic click echoed in the room so sharply that Simon flinched. You're right, Madison, I said. Security should be here. But not for me. I did not hand the badge to her. I slid it across the table toward Simon. It spun over the polished wood and stopped in front of his shaking hands. Madison frowned, irritated that I was doing anything not included in her script. What is that? She asked. I ignored her and kept my eyes on Simon. Turn it over. Look at the serial number under the barcode. He obeyed, still confused. Then the color drained from his face so fast it was almost elegant. He dropped the badge as if it had burned him. Oh, he whispered. One syllable, but it sounded like an entire legal career catching fire. Madison shot to her feet. What Simon stammered that the board meeting needed to be delayed and forensics had to be called in. Madison snapped, unable to understand why a peeling little ID badge had turned her top lawyer into a man on the edge of collapse. I smiled then. Not kindly, not warmly, but with the calm satisfaction of somebody turning the final key in a lock. Because, I said, that badge isn't just an employee pass. It's a wire. For the first time since I entered the room, I watched real confusion hit Madison's face. And confusion was the one thing she could not perform her way through. The silence after that sentence was not the usual boardroom silence where people pretend to think deeply so they look strategic. This was the silence of a body realizing the blade has already gone in. Madison looked back and forth between me and Simon as if someone just needed to explain it properly, and then everything would return to her control. But Simon was long past control. He was staring at the badge on the table like it might strike. I asked him if he had a reader. He nodded automatically and dug a small USB scanner out of his bag. The kind legal usually used to verify visitor passes. His hands were shaking so badly he missed the port the first time. When he finally scanned the badge, green text began flooding his laptop screen in a downward rush. Entry logs, session chain, metadata packets, document notary records, device signatures, current session. Madison moved around the table. heels clicking faster now. "What the hell is that?" she demanded. Simon answered in a voice that had almost no life left in it. "Logs. All of it." I told him to open the folder marked current session. He did. A window appeared showing the current date. Current time. Attendee IDs. Active file traces. And one line that might as well have been a judicial ruling retaliatory termination event. Madison shouted that I was recording them and that it was illegal. I leaned back against the wall for the first time in the meeting and felt strangely comfortable. I told her to review her employment contract. Section 14. Paragraph B. All executive meetings held on company property were subject to internal monitoring for quality and compliance assurance. Mr. Henderson had written it 20 years ago to catch petty office theft. Madison had just used it to hang herself. Simon added the piece that finally made her face change. This was not just an internal monitoring tool. It was a board-designated chain of custody device recognized as a federal audit instrument. That was when fear showed up, not irritation. Not arrogance. Not disbelief. Fear. And once fear enters a room like that, the game is no longer about power. It is about survival. Once Simon understood what he was looking at, I started laying out the rest of the cards. I spoke slowly. Not for dramatic effect, but because I wanted every word to settle into the wood, to the air, and their memories. Over the last 4 months, every time they discussed bypassing customs regulations, my badge had logged it. Every time Tyler bragged about paying off that inspector in Miami, it logged that too. Every time Madison approved a vendor payment to a Cayman shell company from her personal iPad while connected to the boardroom Wi-Fi, the system captured the handshake, verified the device ID, and stamped the transaction context. Madison froze. I pointed to the manila folder. "That isn't my severance packet. It's the index." She opened it with trembling fingers. Page 1 was a summary of unauthorized vendor payments totaling $4.2 million. Page 2 contained transcripts of conversations about illegally firing protected veteran employees. Page 3 was a time-stamped record showing Madison directing IT to delete subpoenaed emails. Each page was short enough that it could not be dismissed as context manipulation, but dense enough to make any investigator feel like Christmas had come early. Then I brought up the hazmat reclassification scheme, the one where they had discussed coding hazardous chemical transport as ordinary dry goods to save 15% on insurance premiums. Simon put his head in his hands and asked Madison if she had really approved it. She tried to call it a coding error. I cut in and reminded her that the logs showed she overrode the warning flag twice. Twice is not an error. Twice is intent. Madison started circling the room like a trapped animal testing the fence. She still had not fully grasped the scale of the collapse. I had. This was no longer about losing a title or a public narrative. This was the language of criminal exposure. And in that language, charisma has no value. Data does. Every time, I let Madison keep flipping through the first few pages before I delivered the sentence that dropped the temperature in that room even further. I didn't just save it to a hard drive. Her head snapped up. I glanced at my watch. 2:15 p.m. That glitchy server connection I had all week wasn't a technical issue. It was the upload. Nearly a terabyte of data went to the Swiss external audit firm retained by the board. The transfer finished at 1:55. I paused just long enough for it to land. The automated alert has probably already reached the chairman. Madison turned to Simon like a drowning woman grabbing for something that might float. "Fix it. Fix it now." Simon closed his laptop, removed his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man whose skull had suddenly aged 10 years. "I can't fix this," he said. "The toothpaste isn't just out of the tube. The tube has been launched into the sun." Madison screamed that she would fire him too if she had to. I told her she couldn't. Because 20 minutes earlier, the second I formally handed over that badge and triggered whistleblower protection, federal law stepped into the room. If she tried to fire Simon now, he became a witness. Somehow, even in the middle of all that panic. I nearly laughed. People who use authority like a hammer never imagine the law has a recoil mechanism. Then the phones started buzzing. One, then another, then a third. Madison's iPhone lit up face up on the table, Chairman Vance. She stared at it like refusing to answer could reverse reality. I told her she should probably pick up. He hated voicemail. She declined the call and looked at me with pure distilled hatred. Even then, she still clung to the old executive fantasy that this was just a few logs. A few records. Nothing strong enough to bring down a CEO. I looked at her and thought how extraordinary it is that people can rise so high in corporate life without ever understanding what immutable actually means when a serious person says it. Madison did what people like her always do when denial stops working. She started bargaining. First came minimization, aggressive accounting, industry practice, coding error, Tyler's initiative. Each excuse fell apart almost as soon as she spoke it. And then her voice changed. Softer. Quieter. Transactional. What do you want? She asked me. Money. A settlement? A consulting fee? She said it like she was negotiating with a difficult vendor, rather than the woman who had just laid her future out on the table in numbered pages. I told her I did not want money. I wanted my company back. She gave me the insult she probably thought would put me in my place. I was just a middle manager. Nobody. I told her I was the one who kept the lights on. The drivers paid. And the cargo inspected, so we did not accidentally ship a dirty bomb into a port. People like her saw companies as tickers and brand assets. I saw the human beings underneath the glass doing the work that made those tickers possible. Right then, a high-priority message flashed on Simon's laptop. He opened it, read it, and closed his eyes. Then he announced, in the exhausted voice of a man who knew exactly what history would remember him for, that the board had convened an emergency session and was placing Madison on immediate administrative leave. All system access was revoked. She grabbed her iPad and tried to unlock it. Access denied. Then her laptop. System locked. She looked up, and for the first time, she no longer looked like a CEO. She looked like a person unplugged from the machine she thought she owned. The boardroom door opened. It was not security for me. It was Tyler. Sweaty and pale. Carrying a cardboard box full of his personal belongings, like every mediocre middle operator ever ejected from a collapsing regime. HR had already terminated his contract for unauthorized data transfer. He saw the badge on the table and understood. Then the heavy footsteps came down the hallway. The real security team had arrived. And this time, they knew exactly who they were escorting out. When Frank and the second guard appeared in the doorway and addressed Madison in that flat, immovable tone only seasoned security professionals can manage, I suddenly remembered why I had taken all of this so far. It was never about wounded pride. It was not about severance. It certainly was not about winning some executive ego contest. I did it because 10 years earlier, this company had nearly died from internal rot. Back then, a regional vice president in the Midwest had been running a kickback scheme with a construction contractor. He skimmed millions and slashed warehouse safety budgets to feed it. Then a roof collapsed in Kansas City. 2 men died. One of them was 22 years old. Mr. Henderson flew there himself, met with the families, and paid for the funerals out of his own pocket. When he came back, he called me into his office. I was just an analyst then, and honestly thought I was about to be fired for escalating too many concerns. He stood by the window, watching gray rain hit the city, and said, "We failed. I failed." I told him we could tighten the audits. He shook his head. "Audits are paper," he said. "Paper can be forged." What he needed was a conscience. Someone who did not care about being liked by executives. Someone who cared more about truth than stock price. That was the day Project Glasshouse was born. The badge was never just a surveillance device. It was a covenant. The board gave me a specific charter to protect the integrity of company operations from every threat, internal and external. I took that responsibility like an oath. When Madison arrived, I really did try to give her a chance. But once she started dismantling the safety controls we had built after those deaths, I knew she was not just greedy. She was erasing memory. And if I let that happen, people would die again. I had seen what negligence looks like after the headlines fade. I was never going to let this company bury another body under a slide deck. Madison did not leave quietly. She shouted about lawsuits, misogyny, and conspiracies all the way to the elevator. As if choosing the right fashionable words could magically turn criminal conduct into a thought leadership panel about adversity. When the elevator doors finally closed, the entire floor seemed to exhale. Simon remained at the table, looking 10 years older than he had 20 minutes earlier. He asked me what happened next. I told him the truth. Next came cleanup. But we live in an era that never lets people like Madison disappear with dignity. By the time I got home that night, after 6 straight hours briefing external auditors, my niece texted me a link. Madison had published a Medium article cross-posted to LinkedIn. Silenced by the old guard how traditionalism kills innovation, she cast herself as a visionary woman crushed by a patriarchal, obsolete corporate immune system. She did not name me. But she described a toxic mid-level bureaucrat who weaponized administrative loopholes to sabotage progress. It spread fast. The comments were full of cheap applause from people who love slogans more than evidence. The next morning, the board was in a panic because the stock was wobbling. They wanted to respond. But legal could not release the fraud file while the investigation was still active. I sat at the end of the table, drinking coffee from the old machine we had reinstalled, and told them they did not need to leak the fraud first. They needed to leak the hypocrisy. I opened my laptop and played badge audio from Madison's private lunches in the executive suite. Her voice was sharp and unmistakable as she mocked employees over 40 as smelling like mothballs and failure, and suggested cutting their benefits until they quit. Another clip was even worse. She joked that if old trucks crashed, insurance would pay and the company could write them off. That was all it took. The truth, in her own voice, was more than enough to collapse her victim story. By noon, the audio clips were exactly where they needed to be: trade journals, internal channels, and every place employees and investors would see them at once. Within hours, Madison's image as a silenced innovator disintegrated. The hashtags flipped. By that afternoon, news broke that the SEC had opened a formal investigation into her personal finances after I traced the Cayman Shell Company and found the beneficiary trust tied to her maiden name. She had not just manipulated the company, she had siphoned money out to seed her next startup. Not just fraud, embezzlement. The weeks that followed were a useful bloodbath. The board gave me temporary authority to clean house. And I used it. I fired Tyler. I fired the brand ambassadors. I fired the 24-year-old VP of Synergy. I dismissed the external consulting circus. We repainted the walls beige, brought back the old coffee vendor, and rehired people who actually understood how the company functioned before it was turned into a branding experiment. The office became boring again. Beautifully boring. Then Chairman Vance tried to buy me off. Early retirement. Full benefits. Double pension. A check large enough to buy a beach house. All in exchange for the badge and deletion of the archives. I picked up the check, looked at it, and tore it in half. I told him I had not saved the company for the board. I had saved it for the people in maintenance, dispatch, and fleet operations. The badge stayed on my hip, and so did I. 3 months later, Madison took a plea deal and was banned from ever serving as an officer of a public company again. As for me, they gave me a new title that sounded almost ridiculous, but came with better pay: Chief Integrity Officer. The company is boring again. Trucks move. Plan is land. Lights stay on. That was all I ever wanted. And if you enjoy workplace stories where the person who thinks they control the room is the one who gets walked out in the end, subscribe to the channel now. Around here, we do not just tell office drama, We keep records on it.